My spiritual journey actually starts with some ancestors. So I want to tell you a little bit about my family background, going back several generations. In fact, I want to start with Matthew Stubbart, who is my great-great-grandfather.
You have that just a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Great-grandfather Matthew learned about the church somehow. Back then, the concept of this build a beautiful, wonderful community that they call Zion, and he wanted to be a part of that. And so he took his family and he headed west to Utah, where he understood that was where they were building this Zionic community. But along the way, he lost his wife. That is, his wife decided that she would get a better reward in the afterlife if she was married to a bishop rather than just to Matthew. So she became she became the multiple wife of a Mormon bishop, left the family. Well, Matthew turned around, took his family, and went back to southern Illinois, in what was called the Brush Creek area, the Brush Creek congregation. Brush Creek congregation is rather interesting in that it did not follow any of the people who were claiming to be leaders of the church after Joseph Smith was killed. They stayed pretty much just following along what they had believed. And so Matthew Stubbart joined that group. And in 1862, the Brush Creek congregation at a meeting at the Red Brick Store joined the reorganization in mass. We don't know that Matthew was part of that group. We would assume that he was because he was in Brush Creek, and his son, my great-great-grandfather James Stubbart, became a 70 missionary for the RLDS Church. James would have been about 30 when they joined the RLDS Church, and so I would assume that he was just part of that joining. But he became a 70, served primarily in northeastern Wyoming. We don't know that he served with Jan's great uncle, who served as a 70 in eastern Colorado, but they certainly were serving the church at the same time. So one of Jan's ancestors, my ancestor, were both missionaries serving the RLDS Church at the same time back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. James set up his family at the church headquarters in Lamoni, Iowa. So he built a house here. His family was here, and then without Persia script, he left to go be a missionary and left the family to be taken care of as best they could. If you go from the church 1 block west, that's Silver Street, and then 1 block south, I think that's 3rd Street, and you stand there in the middle of that intersection and look southeast, you'll be looking at the James Stubbart house. So he built a house not too far from the church back then, and the family, of course, was part of the Lamoni congregation.
Yes, but he's already
one of the stories that is told family-wise, and there's a lot of different versions of how the story came about, but the family was struggling like so many of those did back then. They weren't getting the kind of support from the community they really felt like they needed food-wise. And James's wife, Mary, was May, not Mary. May was praying diligently for how is she going to feed her family. And heard something at the door, and she went to the door and opened it, and there was a bag of food. Now, there's some question about what was in that bag. I've heard a bag of potatoes. I've heard other things. But what what there is a general agreement to is that in the fresh snow there were no tracks. And yet there was the bag of food that she'd heard the door rattle, and there was the bag of food. And so they were blessed. James lived a good long life. He was 89 when he passed. Fortunately, I get some of that data from Jim Jones's wonderful web page of the cemetery, because James and his wife and family are buried out there at Rose Hill Cemetery. But in James' later years, he lived to 89. In his later years, he had trouble with vision, couldn't see well, he had trouble hearing, he couldn't hear very much, but he was at church every time the doors were open. And somebody asked him at one point, why do you go to church when you can't hear what's going on and you can't see what's going on? Why do you come? And James said, I believe in the ministry of presence. And so that's a background for my life, to believe, okay, it's important to be to church. James had a son named John. John grew up here in Lamoni. There is a indication, and I haven't found it recently, that John at a real early age, like 20s, or very, very early 20, may have been a marshal here in Lamoni. But anyway, we do know that John fell for a young lady named Audrey Morford. And he fell pretty hard, apparently, because the Morfords moved to southern Missouri. And then John decided to follow along, and so he went to southern Missouri. So here were John and Audrey in southern Missouri together, and that was not acceptable back then without being married. And so they had to get married. They got married. That would have been about 1911, when John was 21 and Audrey was 16. So in 1912, a year later, Enid was born. And Audrey was advised that it was bad luck to cut a baby's fingernails until they were at least a year old. Bad luck, I don't know exactly what that was. They turned into a witch or something really terrible. So they didn't, so Audrey didn't cut Enid's fingernail, and Enid scratched her nose severely. It became highly infected and treated enough that it deformed her nose, and she lived with that deformity for the rest of her life and vigorously fought against superstitions. Mom wanted to make sure that people quit believing some of those stupid superstitions, like don't cut your baby's fingernails.
Oh, wow.
John and Audrey then moved to a homestead in northeastern Wyoming near the Devil's Tower. I wish I knew more about what was going on back then, because I interpreted that there was a church group, a group of RLDS members, kind of homesteaded in the same general area in northeastern Wyoming, because well, I know the Coles, Clifford Cole came from that group, and you may remember Clifford was here at Graceland, and then he was an apostle for the church for many years. The McElroys came from there, and Bill maybe can tell us more about that. And I suspect there were some other families, but the Stubberts, McElroys, and Coles, at least I know, were homesteading there in the same general area in northeastern Wyoming near Devil's Tower. Enid spent most of her growing up years in Independence, living with her grandmother Morford. That way she could go to school and get maybe some medical help. She developed a very close relationship with Israel A. Smith. I think Israel probably administered to her a few times. I know she was very, very close to him. And so as a result, I think of that more than anything else, she strongly supported church leadership through her whole life. I never heard her say anything negative about any church leadership. I'm sure that she spent some time with her folks, the homestead in Wyoming. That was probably during the summers more than any other time. So we have Enid living in Independence, the rest of the family mostly living in Wyoming, Enid sometimes going back and forth. Okay, now I want to switch over to the other side of the family.
Oh my
Don,
gosh, Dad, we're still not to you.
no, we're still not to me. You want me to?
You weren't supposed to hear
Oh,
that.
I got to tell you this background. Don and Anna DeBarthe lived on a homestead on the Powder River. And, this is all background to make me who I am. Don was not a good father and homesteader, and he left the family. I understand that Joe, the oldest, was about 12. He left Anna and her 4 children on the homestead and disappeared. That was not very good, but that had an effect on how you treat your family as a man in the DeBarthe family. Daughter Jean, developed an eye problem, and Anna went to Salt Lake City for an expert to try to find out how we help that out. And while she was in Salt Lake City, I don't know the details, but some kind of problems occurred. She was in trouble, and some people from an RLDS church movement helped her out. And so she ended up joining that church, which was significant because when Joe graduated from high school, he wanted to go to college, and from the homestead there wasn't enough income for a college, so to go to college. So he found that his mother's church college in Iowa would allow him to work on the farm and go to class. So he agreed that he would go to Graceland College, but he said at the time, they're not going to make a Mormon out of me. So to get to college, he didn't have any transportation. And so the story is he hitchhiked. And Carl Mesley and others indicate that probably what he looked like when he got there, he did far more hiking than he did hitching. In the mid 1930s, you can believe that. So to walk over 500 miles to go to college says how important it was for him to get that education. And before he left Graceland, he was serving the church as a deacon. I understand he worked on a farm up in northern Iowa during the summer. He returned to Wyoming and spent some time working then with a Stubbert family that he met, and he began teaching school. Back in those days, the church went to reunion at the Devil's Tower. We did have church reunions in the 1930s. And so I went to the Devil's Tower reunion. Enid had not been there, but she went out. She was there. That would have been the summer of 1935. She was there with the Stubberts, and they went to reunion. As they drove onto the reunion grounds, this young man came running up and jumped on the running board of the car and said, "Hi, folks." And Joe and Enid met.
Joe.
Joe and Enid were sitting in a service during that week, and Enid suddenly saw a scroll roll out before her, and on the scroll was written, and I don't remember the exact words, but something on the order of, "This man is worthy to be the father of your children." So they began dating. Both of them were teaching one-room country schools some distance apart. I don't know how far, but I know the closest that could have been was 2 miles. Because that's the distance they set schools back then. It may have been 4 or 6, but anyway, for a guy who walked 500 miles to go to school, walking 2 miles or so to court was no problem whatsoever. And his mother said that winter they had snow that went up over the fences. So Joe strapped on his skis and cross-country skied to do his courting. In the spring then of 1936, they were married, and Joe told Enid, "I can give you a very nice ring or 1 year at Graceland." She voted immediately for 1 year at Graceland. So they came to Graceland, and as often happens to young couples like that, they got pregnant. They decided that they would name their first child, if it was a son, David, and he would serve the Lord. Now you know why the background's important to me. spring semester, Enid got expelled. You can't have pregnant women on campus.
No, terrible.
One of the faculty members was more lenient than others, and he agreed whether she could slip on campus and sit in the class. But Linda remembers it as the dean of students. I remember it as the registrar. It doesn't particularly matter. One of the church officials caught her on campus, grabbed her by the elbow, escorted her off, and told her she was not to be on that campus ever.
Oh my goodness.
So she was expelled from Graceland. However, David was born. I was born that spring while my parents were attempting to attend Graceland anyway. So Graceland starts way back in my background, very, very early. The folks returned to Wyoming and taught, and Dad taught at a one-room country school, and Enid cared for the family. Jerry was born 17 months after I was. And church was important, but too far away to attend. I know that they attended church on occasion, but what I heard from Mother, she was so isolated. I know they didn't attend church very often, but I know they attended church because one time during my adult years, Mom and I were doing something on music, and she said, "I remember you when you were just a little tiny tyke, standing out in the yard and singing to the rooster and waving a stick at him." And what was going on? And I suddenly remembered. It just very suddenly popped clear to me. I remember seeing grandmother standing in front of the congregation, waving a baton. They didn't have any instrumental music at all. So to keep the congregation singing together, grandmother stood up there and beat time to the music, waving a stick. So David learned to wave a stick and sing. As you know, teachers sometimes don't get the highest salaries, etc. There was one year at least when Joe was offered a position in a school district, and they promised that housing would be provided. They didn't have to worry about housing. It would be provided for them. So that fall, when they went there to get their housing, they discovered that the housing that was arranged for them was a sheep shed that they had to scoop the manure out of before they could move the family in.
Oh my.
The conditions where we lived, though, that sheep shed was some distance from where Dad was teaching. I remember when he came home. So anyway, I had Mom and Dad and my little brother Jerry and my dog Pal. And I loved to walk around. I remember one occasion I walked, I described to my mom when I got home where I'd walked, and she didn't believe me. No little guy that small could have walked that far. So I did my walking without telling anyone from that point on. And then I do remember one time I was walking out there in the prairie of Wyoming, and suddenly my dad pops over the fence and starts spanking me. And what did I do? I was lost as far as they were concerned. Now, whether I was actually lost or not, at that point, I had not recognized I was lost if I was lost. I'm sure I still had Pal with me, and Pal would have led me home. I'm sure if I was, well, maybe not. Anyway, that tendency to take off by myself, be by myself, has major impact, I'm sure, on my life. You know, that nature or nurture. I am very comfortable being by myself. I'm happy by myself. I can be myself and not have any problem at all. And Jan loves me anyway. When I was 5, I got sick. And they took me, I think it was 100 miles to the doctor, so it didn't go off. And they took me to the doctor. The doctor couldn't figure out what the problem was. So Mother prayed diligently, and I think it was a dream. But anyway, she was told, take your family and go to the land of Zion. Gather. I remember Mom followed what the church official said, and Fred M. Smith had laid out a very, very definite pattern for how you were supposed to gather. You couldn't just show up and say, "Here I am." You were supposed to go to the bishop, plan things out so that you'd know where you were going to be living, you would know what you were going to be doing, you know what contribution you were going to be making to the congregation, to the community. And that was all supposed to be done before you gather.
That's good getting on that. For such so
Most
many
people,
miles away. Yeah, I
most
don't know
people,
how to get it on. I never even heard of Zoom until the other day.
yeah, most people didn't do that, but Mom, and that's the rule that FM Smith had said, and Mom, we were going to follow that rule. So Dad came to Lamoni. He decided he'd like to try farming instead of teaching. After all, he farmed with Graceland and with Summers, so he would try to farm. And so he came to Lamoni, met with the bishop. The bishop helped him, and they found a farm 5 miles west and one south of Lamoni, 120 acres that Dad signed the papers for, and then came back to pack up his family and gather to Zion. They had a Model A coupe. A coupe is a one-seater, but they loaded all their possessions and family in that one-seater Model A coupe. Pal put a leash on him, and he rode on the running board for about 2 miles. And then they left him with another family who had a couple of little girls, and they were not about to try to take Pal 500 miles on the running board of a car. So we left Pal behind, and broke my heart. My best friend Pal was no longer with me. We came across Wyoming, Nebraska. Mom tells in her book how Nebraska in the summertime can get kind of warm. Model A didn't have anything like air conditioning. Air conditioning was to roll the windows down. Here are 4 of us in a one seat with all of the luggage piled around, everything you have, everything you own in a Model A coupe. And Mom said she was, it got depressing. Are we doing the right thing? This isn't crazy. How are we going to make it? We just anyway. And so all of a sudden, I started singing. I'm not going to sing it for you. God will take care of you. Be not afraid. So she perked up and came on to Lamoni. Dad somehow had made close acquaintance with Paul and Pearl Camel and their children, Glenn, who was at that point in elementary school, and David, who was an infant. And we moved in with the Paul and Pearl Camel family that fall and summer. Doctors diagnosed me with scarlet fever, and they put me to bed as much as they could. They kept me in bed as much as they could for that winter. And back then, when there was a lot of renters on farms, and in order to move from one farm to another, how do you move to the next farm if there's somebody already living on it? Back then, everybody moved on March 1st. That domino effect, and everybody could move, but it was on March 1st. And so on March 1st, we moved to our 120-acre farm, March 1st of 1943. We attended the Evergreen congregation. Dad was quickly appointed, a youth director, and immediately got in trouble because you don't do softball on Sunday. Sunday's the day of rest. And that didn't work out. But I was baptized in a farm pound just south and a little west of the Evergreen Church. Somewhere along about that time, there was kind of a devastating experience for the family. I had Mom's brother, just younger than she was, had 2 little children, Gary Lee and Jeannie. I think Gary Lee was about 5 and Jeannie was about 3. And that winter, they went out on the pond ice and fell through the ice and drowned. And that was devastating to the family. At that time, Mother had been talking a lot with a neighbor who was a Saturday Adventist. And the Saturday Adventists believe very strongly that you sleep in the grave until the final resurrection. And Mother was unsure. She just, that didn't work. There's that scripture that when Jesus was crucified, he said, "This day thou will be with me in paradise." Oh, so Mother asked about that, and they said, "Well, there's a period after day." Jesus said, "This day thou will be with me in paradise." And so that's why they handled the sleeping in the grave. And anyway, Mother struggled with that, and she had a vision, and she saw my great great. She saw Matthew Stubbert sitting in a chair with Jeannie, who was about 3, on his lap, and Gary Lee standing at his knee asking him questions. And he was answering Gary Lee's questions. And she told us that story, and that gave us a lot of comfort to know that Gary Lee and Jeannie were still continuing a wonderful life in that next dimension. With 3 other families, then we formed a mission out west of where we lived called Riley Center. That's because we met in the Riley Center schoolhouse. There were, I think, 4 families altogether, that church families that all lived out there within about 3-4 miles of each other. And we formed this Riley Center mission. My brother Jerry was baptized in a pond there. And even in that congregation, there was still grumbling when we played softball on Sunday. The pastor's daughter was getting engaged, had gotten engaged. One church service, Mother stood and, under the inspiration of the Spirit, told the daughter that she needed to be thinking about it, be very careful, pray about it diligently, be careful. You want to be sure this is what you want to do. And after the service, then the pastor cornered Mother and really let her have it, because women didn't do that kind of thing. No woman ever spoke under the inspiration of the Spirit. That was something for priesthood, and she wasn't to do that kind of thing in his congregation ever again. So she didn't. But I think the congregation suffered because of that. The daughter went ahead and got married, and within 3 years they were divorced. So a few years after that, the pastor's family moved away, and the congregation, or the mission, folded up, and Dad was asked to be pastor down at Lone Rock. Lone Rock congregation, I had about 3 or 4 families that attended. So he was pastor at Lone Rock when the family went down there. That was my junior high and senior high years, primarily. I was elected church school director at about age 14 or 15. Church school director's job was to plan a worship service for Sunday school worship service every morning, and the adults took care of the classes. Took that on, but so I had to plan a worship service every Sunday, and that was basically a poem and a hymn, and let it go at that. It wasn't very edifying, probably, but I do remember we came to Lamoni, I think, for state conferences. We met frequently enough in Lamoni that I remember. I don't know, Lou, if you can hear me, I remember a baptism at the Coliseum, but I remember it in the basement of the Coliseum in a big stock tank, rather than up on the platform. And if they did a stock tank full of water on the platform, I expect they moved it to the basement pretty quickly, because that would have been pretty risky structure-wise. But I do remember baptism in the stock tank, the basement of the Coliseum. And I remember going to Sunday school in the building, which is it's the northwest corner of Main and Linden, across the street from the bank. We called it the Hy-Vee building back then, but for us, well, I remember those experiences of state conference, of meeting with the young people. And I remember Sunday school where we had a Sunday school offering, and the children's offering was going to buy the bell for the church, the new church that we were in the process of getting ready to build and building. and we bought a bell, and I'm sorry that the bell didn't turn out to be extremely musical, and we still don't, we can't use that bell today, and I'm sorry about that because we children did the best we could to chip in our part of our allowances if we had that money we could for creating or for putting a bell in the church. When I graduated from high school, growing up on the farm, there just wasn't money for college, but Graceland College, there was no choice. It was Graceland or nothing, almost. So ready to go to Graceland, and how are we going to do that? The folks worked out a plan with the Paul Loving family, where the folks provided a beef and probably a pork and other produce from the farm for the Loving family, and the Loving family then provided me with board and room. So I didn't have to pay board and room at Graceland, but I could attend classes. So all I had to do was come up with the money for the tuition kind of thing. How was I going to do that? The plan was I would go to Independence and live with my grandmother and grandfather in Independence and work in Independence. And that became a life-changing experience over time. And as I tell you the experience over time, you'll understand what that means. The first year after I graduated from high school, I didn't have any transportation. I was walking, exploring the streets, trying to find a job. I found a store downtown that would let me try to sell vacuum cleaners. Actually, they called it an electric broom. It was a little device that wasn't much bigger than a broom, and it was electric, and you could use it sweep. And so I spent one day trying to sell vacuum cleaners and figured out very quickly that I was not personality inclined to be a salesman in any way, shape, or form. Gave that up very quickly and continued to look for work. Didn't have much luck. And then grandmother came home from Wednesday night church, told me that she'd been talking to Lloyd Hirschman. Lloyd Hirschman was the personnel director for a company over in Kansas City. He was looking for good employees, and so she recommended me, and he would pick me up first thing early Thursday morning, and we'd go to work. And so Lloyd Hirschman picked me up Thursday morning, and we went to work, and I spent that summer working with Lloyd in the grease and oil company over on the state line. It was that far over, but it was a wonderful experience. I got to know the Lloyd Hirschman family very well. Their two little girls, their two twin girls, which incidentally, as most of you know, one of those twin girls became one of the first presidency of the church. So I got to know that family very early on, and it was a wonderful experience. On that first week, though, after I started to work, got a letter from the folks. Tithing was a very important thing to the folks. They thought they taught us time we were baptized. We filled out our tithing statement every year, supposedly kept our record books, filled out our tithing statements, paid our tithing. And I did that because I had to. I filled out my tithing statement, gave my little bit of money to my dad when I left high school to go to work. Got a letter from Dad's mom saying Wednesday night, Dad had delivered my tithing to the bishop. That was the Wednesday night that grandmother had talked to Lloyd Hirschman. Didn't register much at that time, but then we come along to the next year. The next year, Lloyd Hirschman had changed to a different job. He still wasn't under church appointment. He had a different job. So Batten felt the grease and oil company wasn't an option because I still didn't have transportation. I did have a bicycle. And one Wednesday evening, my aunt came by and said she'd heard that Mulkey Haywater Company down on 50 Highway and Nolan Road was hiring. So Thursday morning, I jumped on my bicycle early and rode down Nolan Road. Now, fortunately, back then, it wasn't as traveled as it is today. Nolan and 50 would, anyway. I rode my bicycle down to 50 Highway, found the Mulkey Haywater Company. And I got there and there was nobody there at first, and then the night watchman found me. kind of took me under his wing, showed me around the plant, visited with me. I think looking back now, he was probably making sure that I stayed out of trouble. But when the boss came in, he introduced me to the boss, recommended me. With my farm background, this was a company that made elevators specifically for bales of hay, called it a hayovator. And they manufactured from base metal, from steel. They manufactured these hayovators, and they had an assembly line, and they needed somebody on the assembly line to put together the hayovator. And so I was hired, and my job was to put the drive mechanism together for the hayovators as they came down the assembly line, riding my bicycle. Fortunately for me, my grandmother Anna passed, and I inherited her car. So I only had about a week or two that I rode my bicycle to work down Nolan Road to 50 Highway from Independence. But as I should have known, I didn't at the time, got a letter from Mom and Dad. My tithing had gone to the bishop the Wednesday that my aunt had said, hey, Mulkey's hiring. So whatever that was worth at that point. The next summer, I again went down to Mulkey to check. I had a car, so I could check other places, but first thing I did was drive down to Mulkey and check, and they weren't hiring. Okay, so I proceeded to look for other jobs, drive to Kansas City and Independence. One Thursday morning, got a request to take a bunch of Boy Scouts down to scout camp, since I had a car. I agreed to do that. Took the scouts down to scout camp. When I got back, the phone was ringing. I answered the phone, and it was Mulkey calling me and asking me to come to work. And that was Thursday morning. Wednesday night, my dad had given the tithing check to the bishop. He seemed like I would have figured out, but I hadn't yet at that point, that there might be a correlation here of some sort. Mulkey let me go early that year, 1st of August. I had enough money. That was going to Iowa State. I had enough money to pay for 1 year of school. And 1st of August, and we got to have a wonderful vacation. Mom and Dad and Paul and I don't know where Jerry was, but we had a wonderful vacation going to Colorado, Estes Park, Wyoming, visiting relatives and friends. Wonderful vacation that time, and then a year at Iowa State. So the next summer, when I got time to pay my tithing, I didn't have the money. I've been short, and I didn't have any money to pay my tithing. So I promised the Lord that I would give him my first check. Went to Independence, and nobody was hiring because Sheffield Steel was on strike, and there were people all over the place who were wanting short-time work. There was nothing available. Finally, I got a call from aunt and uncle over at the Quad Cities, Illinois, Iowa. So I went over and spent a week with them. They said there were a number of jobs available, but when I got there weren't. I did find one possibility as a roustabout in a carnival. But I looked at that job very carefully, fortunately, and discovered that the expenses that I would have to go through in order to take care of myself while they traveled around the country, and the income that I would earn just about balanced out. So I would end up the summer with zero. That wasn't going to pay for a year of college, so I rejected that job. I heard about a job at Fort Madison. I went down and applied for that one. It was with a steel company, and I would have to go up the steel high-rise kind of, several floors up kind of building, and I have a real uncomfortability with heights, so that wasn't going to work at all, and they didn't hire me anyway. So then I heard that Graceland was building a Tess Morgan Hall. So I came back to Graceland and applied, and I got hired on helping build Tess Morgan Hall. My job was to take wheelbarrow of concrete from up close to Walker Hall, rolled it across the ground and down a ramp to pour concrete for the footings for the building. And as you can imagine, a wheelbarrow of concrete weighs a heck of a lot more than I do. And so that was a real challenge. I had, at the end of the first day, I had blisters. By the end of the week, I was in, but I managed to stay with it 2 weeks and they laid me off. I had just enough money to pay my tithing or to pay for a part of a semester at Grace or at Iowa State. I had no other money. Do I keep the money for my education or do I pay my tithing? And I decided I had promised the Lord I would pay my tithing. So I paid my tithing, drove down to Independence, stayed with Grandma and Grandpa. Sheffield Steel was hiring, so I went over to Sheffield Steel and applied, went through their test, found that you have to be able to pass the eye test without glasses. And I couldn't do that. I failed their eye test. So that one didn't work out. I went out into the parking lot and there was a young fellow in the parking lot who was looking for a ride over to the city. And yeah, sure, why not? We climbed in and we drove over toward the city. And he said he knew about a place that hired during the summer. I guess he'd worked for them once. He said it's heavy work. It's terrible heavy work. Well, that wasn't going to bother me after running wheelbarrows of concrete up and down a ramp. So I found out where it was. It was down in South Kansas City. It was an ice company. They it, to get there, I had to cross the railroad tracks and go along some farm fields and back along the railroad tracks. What they did was freeze 300-pound blocks of ice. And then they took that ice and back then they used it to ice down the refrigerator cars on the railroad. That was before the mechanical refrigerator came in. So they used that to ice refrigerator, ice fruit and vegetable cars coming through for the railroad. So they had these 300-pound blocks of ice and they hired me. My job was to take the ice. Oh, they make the ice and they dump it on a big elevator and it would take it up to the upper level and then it'd slide off the elevator and then somebody had to take it from there and store it. And my job was to take the ice from the elevator and take those 300-pound blocks of ice and store them up in the storage area. Then also they used me once in a while to help on the railroad to ice cars. It didn't pay an awful lot, but it paid time and a half for overtime. And because they worked for the railroad, it was 24-hour call. So there's a 40-hour work week with 24-hour call for any time a railroad came in. So I ended up working about 60 hours a week. That worked out pretty well. I was gaining anyway. And then about the 1st of August, I got a call one morning and said, the caller said, "Is this David?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, right now I'm doing nothing." And he said, "Okay, this is Alice Chalmers. We'd like for you to come to work." Now that's Alice Chalmers there in Independence. I had applied there back the first week when I was down there. And so I called the ice company right quick and they agreed I could work for Alice Chalmers and work for the ice company. So I spent 40-hour work week with Alice Chalmers. It was the evening, like 4 to midnight shift. And then the ice company, 24-hour call on the railroad. They didn't call me in those hours when I was working Alice Chalmers, but any other time they called me. I ended up working about 90 hours a week and earned enough money to go to college for another year. At the end of that year, I was pretty exhausted, as you can well imagine. I knew I needed something, so I was coming home. It occurred to me I stopped to see James Thomas, the evangelist, and talked to him about an evangelist blessing. We agreed we'd pray about it, and Sunday he would give me my blessing on my way to Iowa State. And I don't know what happened during that blessing, but my life was changed in a major way. Now, remember, I love to walk. I on the farm, once we got here, as soon as I was old enough to carry a gun, which was about 12, I would spend every free minute I could spend, I spent in the fields and woods rather than being with people. I just didn't need to be with people. But after that evangelist blessing, when I got back to Iowa State, things changed. I became vice president of the Laihona group. The church group was meeting at the college. We were still building the church at that point at Ames. We met at the university. We didn't have a deacon, so setting up chairs, helping get things ready, greeting people, I could do that. And so began really, in many ways, began to serve as a deacon for the church. And then back to I had one more year of school. I decided at that point that engineering was not really where I wanted to be. I only had one course to complete, but I felt like teaching was in my background. Teaching was, we don't know how many generations of teachers, but it's 7 or 8 or 10 generations of teachers in our family. Teaching, to teach science and math in high school sounded like a lot of fun. So I switched to education. I still had that one course to finish in engineering, but I switched to education and took education courses. So I had another year of schooling I had to take. Back to independence. I had put together what was going on with my tithing. Coincidence or something else, scientifically it didn't make sense, but it was happening every year when I got my job, my tithing. That was the day within 24 hours of paying my tithing, I got the job. And that happened 4 years in a row, and this is the 5th year I paid my tithing. I stopped here in Lamoni at the stake office and paid my tithing myself before I headed south. I went down and okay, first thing I want to do, I'm going to go over to the ice company first thing and see how they're doing. And I drove over to the ice company, walked into the office, and the boss said, "David, where's your work clothes?" Of course, I had dressed up a little bit for interviews, etc. He said, "We've got problems at the north end of our dock. It's beginning to disintegrate a little bit. We need that repaired. Go get your work clothes on and get to work." So I went back to Independence, changed my clothes, went back over to the ice company, walked up on the dock, and he said, "David, we've got a train down at the junction. You need to get on the truck with those guys and go ice that car." So I did that and spent the summer working for the ice company. And at the end of the summer, the dock still hadn't been repaired. They kept me busy. Believe what you like about tithing, folks, but I am convinced that when you are generous with the Lord is more than generous back. And so when we were married, Jan and I had told Jan my story, of course. Jan took charge of our finances. I wasn't a dummy. Her father was a bishop, her brother was a bishop, and Jan could do mathematics more than as well as I could. And she was a record keeper. She kept those records to the penny. And so turned the finances over to her. And she loved to every New Year's Eve sit down and close the books, figure out the tithing, and write the check so that the first Sunday of every year our tithing was paid. And the Lord blessed us. There's just no question about that. The Lord continues to bless us. We continue to survive. I still, at this point in our lives, of course, if we go by the increase, which we still inclined to do. Oh, by the way, Jan was very upset when they quit asking for tithing statements, when the church quit asking for tithing statements. She turned them in for probably 5 years after they quit asking for them before we finally quit turning them in. But at this point, I've had to take over all the finances, and the first Sunday of every month, I still write a check for the church because I so strongly believe if you're generous to the Lord, the Lord is going to be generous back. And I can't, there's no scientific proof I can give of that, but it works for us. So the fall of 1961, I returned to Graceland to finish up getting my certificate for teaching. And in an education class, there was Jan Simons. I knew Jan from before because when I was at Graceland the first 2 years, I was extremely blessed to be accepted by Mabel Carlisle Hyde in the chapel choir. And I learned a lot. You know, I'd been in choir in high school, but Mabel Carlisle Hyde she was special in a lot of ways. And so I was in chapel choir, and the Scott who sat next to me, we shared, you know, the music. Scott was dating this Jan Simons, so I got to know Jan indirectly. That was first. She was a freshman when I was a sophomore at Graceland, so I knew of her. So here, when I came back to Graceland after getting my bachelor's degree, oh, incidentally, that was a fun story. Iowa State, when you were a senior, if you were a senior and had an A or a B in your course, you didn't have to take the final. So because I had this one class to go to get my bachelor's in mechanical engineering, I held on to that class until the last quarter, took all my education classes and everything else, and didn't have to take any finals all that year. And then took that final engineering course that last quarter and got my engineering degree and a lot of coursework toward my teaching certificate. So here in education class was this Jan Simons. Jan was a neat gal, but I was still, you know, I was comfortable with church people, but I wasn't comfortable with social small talk. You know, I could go to church, be very comfortable with church people, but other than that, I was still very, very timid. And so Jan and I were in class till October at least, and one of my friends made very sure that I knew that a guy had taken Jan to the ball game. Well, that wasn't going to do. I got up my courage and I asked Jan to go to a ball game with me, a basketball game, and she agreed. I found out years later, not too many years later, I found out years later that during that summer, or very late summer, there was some activity at Graceland, and I don't remember what it was, but they had the DeBarthe family do a demonstration family worship. Our family worships were pretty informal. We usually sit around the table and somebody would ask a question and we would kick it around. We really, you know, it was anything goes. So we kind of demonstrated that, sang a hymn or two. Jan was sitting in the congregation, and I didn't know that at that point. She told me later that she was sitting in the congregation and listened to me and said, "That's the guy I'm going to marry." So here we are in this class, and she's not making any moves toward me. But I asked her to go to the ball game with me, and she agreed. When I took her home from the ball game, I asked her if she'd be willing to go to church with me Sunday, and she agreed. And we dated then continuously through that year. Came along to Valentine's Day. I had ordered a ring for Jan. You know, Lamoni didn't have a ring shop at that point. The Arkle jewelry had burned down. And so I had ordered through a catalog a ring. It came the day before Valentine's Day. Back then, some of you will remember that the library was the upper floor of Briggs. And the way into the library was through the north door. The south door was sealed up. You couldn't get in through the south door. But that made the stairwell up to that south door of Briggs, up to the third floor. Well, that stairwell was there, but no use for it. But it was very private. And Jan and I had discovered this little private nook up at the top of that stairwell. So I took Jan with me up to the top, and I offered her a ring and myself, and she accepted. So on Valentine's Day, 1962, Jan agreed to be my spouse. As we prepared for our wedding, one of the things that I felt impressed to do, and Jan totally agreed, about 3 weeks before our wedding. Oh, I'll tell you about the wedding part that way. We scheduled the wedding for August, but then at World Conference that year, the Simons Harry and Ruth got moved to Detroit International Stake as bishop. And they wanted, Mom particularly wanted Jan to go with them to do a wedding when she was going to be in Detroit and I was going to be in Lamoni. And I knew what would happen. Mom was not highly in favor of me. I was a farm boy. She was, she was not one of my cheerleaders. Mom was hoping for her daughter for something better than me. And so I knew that if she got Jan to Detroit, that the wedding would fall through. So we moved the wedding we agreed. We moved the wedding to June 3rd, the Sunday after graduation. Mom and Dad didn't disagree with that too much. They didn't have much choice. Oh, and incidentally, in March, I was called to the office of priest. And back then, you were basically called, and if you agreed, but you were ordained within a few weeks. So I was called and ordained to the office of priest in March after Jan and I were engaged. So we went to, Jan and I, about 3 weeks before the wedding, went to James Thomas, and we asked for an evangelist blessing on us as a couple. That was well before that kind of thing. Evangelists today will give you blessings for all kinds of things, but back then, the evangelist blessing, one when you were late teen or early 20s, that was about all they did. But we wanted an evangelist blessing on us as a couple. And yes, we got our evangelist blessing, and it was a good experience. Something I didn't excuse me, something I didn't mention back when I got my evangelist blessing. The one thing that stood out, and the only thing I really remember about it, is that I was promised that my science and my religion would never be in conflict. And that has definitely been true. When I got my master's in earth science with all that geology, rather than causing me to begin to doubt God and doubt religion, I just became convinced that God was more patient than we ever realized. If the earth is 5 billion years old, okay, God is really patient. See, that's where we are. So Jan and I then were married on the 3rd of June, which was a communion Sunday. And to heck with those superstitions and traditions, we went to communion together for communion before we had our wedding in the afternoon. And I think that set a tone for our wedding. And that gets me up to where we're married, and we've been married for 62 years, but I'm out of time.
Yes. But David,
But there are a
thank
lot of
you.
experiences between that and now.
I'm sure. I am really happy that you shared so much of your early life. I did not know all of that history. It's very, very interesting.